So we had our selection of readings for philosophy of language, philosophy of education. First, this passage from Aquinas, uh, from his commentary on Aristotle's On Interpretation. This passage is uh, sometimes titled or abbreviated as "How Words Mean." All right, so some things that he goes through here. So written words are signs of vocal words. So writing is a sign of language, of vocal words. Vocal words are signs of passions of the soul, as Aristotle calls them in this passage. Passions of the soul are likenesses of things. So now, if we're, let me go back here. If we're looking at, are these the same for all people? The things, yeah, things in the world, they're the same for everybody. Our experience of them isn't the same. That's individual, but the things themselves are public. Okay? Then the likenesses of them are based on those things. And so those are also, he says, those are the same for everybody. Those are shared public concepts. Now the vocal words differ. So the words we use to communicate about those things are different because we have different languages. And then for the same reason, we have different writing. The writing itself is a sign of the language. The writing is not a sign of the passion of the soul. The writing is not a sign directly of the thing. The writing is the sign of the vocal words. So we have this kind of hierarchy or process here. Now, and it's important to differentiate the logical movement and the ontological movement. So the ontological movement, which makes all of this possible, starts from the things, and we have an experience which and we come to know the species or the form of the thing, okay, and then we have language that refers to it, and then we have writing, okay. So that's the actual process. So going from the primacy of the things in themselves, from being, and then down to the writing. The logical movement goes in the other direction. So the logical movement, we're starting with the words, whether written or vocal. I suppose it doesn't really matter. But anyway, we're going from the signs to the things. So some critical questions that we can take out of this reading. What does Aristotle mean about passions of the soul? Aquinas talks a lot about this. How can concepts of things be passions? And then, do passions of the soul signify things naturally or by human institution? Then, do words signify naturally or by human institution? Then, and this will become important later, does language refer to ideas apart from things? In other words, can we just separate out the passions of the soul by themselves and consider them apart from things? Can the passions of the soul, okay, I just said that, can be separated from the things we experience. Then what does this mean, this question or this statement? We cannot understand without a phantasm. So these are some questions that might stimulate discussion on Aquinas, and we can come back to that. Now, briefly, Saussure, he was if you remember from our discussion of modern philosophy and structuralism, Saussure was a structuralist philosopher, but also a linguist. So he was also a pioneer in the science of linguistics. You might have noticed, if you read this, that he's very fond of dichotomies, of these oppositions, the ear and the voice, the sound versus the idea, the individual versus social, tradition and evolution, outer and inner, and active and passive. But most importantly, one of the most important ones is language and speech. So language is this abstract, invisible layer, and this is determined by the society, and it's something that's established and it's homogeneous, okay? And then speech, on the other hand, is the concrete executive layer. So this is individual and heterogeneous. So we have language and speech. Then the linguistic sign is the most important element here. and that sign is a unity with parts. And Saussure says these are both psychological parts. So this might bring some distinctions between him and Aquinas. So the two parts are the mental fact or the concept or the thing signified. And then on the other hand, we have the linguistic sound, or which he also refers to as the sound image or the signifier. Okay, you can't have one without the other. And he also says that this is not the same thing as thing sign. Okay, so this is, we're not even considering really things here. If you look down at that question at the bottom, does language have anything to do with things? That's, well, in this passage, that's not really addressed. We're just talking about kind of bare concepts. So then he has a concept of the mind and brain as storage, or as something that's inner. And this is a Cartesian view of the mind. So where there's a dichotomy between inner and outer. Before Descartes, if we're looking at the Aristotelian tradition or the Thomistic tradition, there was no dichotomy between, there was no concern about getting out to things from our mind, because nobody ever starts with a bare mind. There's experience of things, and then it's reflexive that we recognize the mind. So and he has this, he says language is passively assimilated by the individual. So come back to that with Wittgenstein next. I don't really have any summaries here, but some critical questions about this passage. And he's talking about language games and about the idea of private language. So some things to ask here: what's the relationship between meaning and use? So what's the relationship between the meaning of a word and the use of that word or concept? Can there be a completely private language for Wittgenstein? Why or why not? Or kind of related to that, is there such a thing as a pure mental concept? And then we want to ask, is this a critique of the Cartesian or the Thomistic view? And then he talks a lot about the criteria for correctness, meaning, and understanding. So how do we come, according to Wittgenstein, how do we come to know that there's correct use, or that somebody has the correct meaning, or that they actually understand? And then we're going to look at his, we definitely want to look at his ideas about whether there can be subjective justification for the use of a word. And then what are some of the modern implications of that in the way it's encouraged to define oneself. Okay, then going on to our passages on education. I didn't quite get to Hannah Arendt, but I'll briefly review the first two. So Aquinas, whether one man can teach another. He mentions that knowledge requires an intellectual light. So this is the agent intellect, or the faculty of reason, which we've discussed before. And then also the species or the form of the thing. So we need the agent intellect and also the form. Then some errors that he mentions. He mentions Averroes. Averroes had a doctrine of one intellect common to all men. And another, that of what he says is the belief of the Platonists, that we already know the forms and that we just recollect them. So Aristotle and Thomas correct this. The intellect is individual, but it is in potency to all the forms. So coming to know something is when the intellect is reduced from potentiality to actuality. And then he mentions two ways to teach, about teaching facts, or he, as he phrases it, put before him certain less universal propositions. So just teaching bare facts that the student is able to assimilate and evaluate for himself one way or another, then strengthening the intellect of the learner, or walking through the process of reasoning, as if as if walking through the all of the order of the logical process. So some questions here is teaching more like building a house or healing someone. And then insofar as he brings in nature, what's the relevance of this statement that art in its work imitates nature? Besides the agent intellect and the passive intellect, what do we need to have in order to actually learn something? So what's required there in the real world to learn something? And then who is ultimately responsible for all learning? Okay, and then John Dewey, My Pedagogic Creed. So he has 5 sections here. First, on education, that it's based on the stimulation of the child's own powers that are the material and starting point for education. He emphasizes throughout that this is both individual, he says psychological, and social. Okay? And this is about, education is about giving the child command of himself, train him to have the full and ready use of all his capacities. So what's the purpose of a school? The school is, he says, primarily a social institution, and education in that case is a process of living. So the school is its own kind of little society in an embryonic way, he says, compared to the real world. He compares his view with the quote unquote old view of schools, which he characterizes as information just being given and ideas just being imposed, and habits as well. But for him, he says the goal of the school is unity of work and thought. So what is the subject matter of education? Well, he talks about that the social life is what provides unity, the unity and background to education. So he always comes back to this social context for everything. And he says we must proceed from undifferentiated social activities, so that the child, in just in his experience living in the world, has experience of all the things that are in the world, but not in a differentiated way where the child experiences something as science, something as literature. And so Dewey says we have to start there, and then gradually, as they get older, differentiate out those subjects as the child grows. He mentions science being valuable for controlling our experience. And then this is interesting too. The process and the goal of education are the same thing. So that might be something to look at. Now, method, he discusses the primacy of action over activity over passivity. So again, this is his going back to his comparison of the old, where he conceives of that as being passive. Okay, what's central to him is he talks about the images and the imagination, and then it's again based on the child's interests. And then he says this somewhat mysterious thing compared to everything else he's talking about: secure the right habits of action and thought with reference to the good, the true, and the beautiful. Well, that sounds really great, but how do we square that with what he said before about school not being about habits? So now, school and social progress. He says that the school and the process of education is the main method of social progress and reform. And then he mentions what the supreme art is. It's the art of thus giving shape to human powers and adapting them to social service. And then, what we want to keep in mind here is that Dewey is a pragmatist philosopher. So he's looking at everything from a very pragmatic viewpoint, and that is where all of this comes from. Now, some critical questions for him: what's the significance, in light of the fact that he's a pragmatist? What's the significance of this being a creed? His mention of prophecy and the kingdom of God. It seems unlike most of his other approach to things. So then if the school is the school and education are the main process for social change, what's the role of the family? How does the family work into that? And then where's true in here, other than his somewhat vague mention at the end of the true, the good, and the beautiful, which sounds really great, but where is truth in what drives the rest of the process before that? So, like I said before, I didn't get to Hannah Arendt. She has a critique of pragmatism in her article, and we can get to that if you like. We've got a lot of material here. I also noticed that I made an error with Hannah Arendt with that citation. I listed on the website to read parts 2 and 3, and then a few people I gave out copies to had parts 3 and 4. It's not really a huge problem, but part 2 does have some interesting critiques of pragmatism, so we can look at that if you want. But at this point, I'm going to open it up and ask where you want to start. If you want to start with language, education, or one of these philosophers, or comparing them, or what most interested you?
Well, I was interested in doing Wittgenstein, but I didn't get to it. I was saving that to last because I thought I had to read 100 pages. But could you refresh us last week? He had an influence, a strong influence on someone we studied last week. Who was that?
That was Anscombe, Elizabeth Anscombe.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Elizabeth Anscombe and also Hannah Arendt. I don't know if I sent you the email or not, but I'm finding trouble with all these new people. What is the context and the historical context in which they are writing? Like, I knew from studying, I looked up Hannah Arendt, and she was a Jew in Nazi Germany and she had to flee. So I kind of got a little bit of like where she was coming from. She's brilliant. She ended up in New York. But both with Anscombe and with Hannah Arendt, John, they seem like they're saying one thing and I'm on board with them, and all of a sudden they flip their conclusion. I feel like, are they talking about socialism? So it's just me. I'm learning philosophy language, and it's hard for me to read and assimilate. But I think they're using these words, and I'm trying to apply modern interpretation to some of their words. That's all. Yeah.
Yeah, that can certainly be a stumbling block sometimes with some of these. Hannah Arendt, that essay, let me see, I have it here. That essay is in a book. It's a collection of essays called Between Past and Future, and she goes through it's kind of the culmination in a series where she's talking about the modern view of history, then the loss of tradition, then the loss of religion and authority, and then how this affects education. She wrote this in the late 50s, and it was published in 1961. So I think that's right. So if you can imagine America in the early 60s, that's where this came out of.
I think she's also making reference to the study that the government came out around the late 50s, Why Johnny Can't Read, because she makes mention of that. She says, wow, the United States is really in an educational crisis. Everybody is writing about this. Everybody knows this. And then she mentions Why Johnny Can't Read. So, it's in that time frame.
Right. And insofar as what she's the larger philosophical things she's responding to, that is largely outlined in Dewey's pedagogic creed. So she is pointing out a loss of authority that results from this, and the loss of tradition. And she's not, the thing is, she's not pointing it out in a way that where she's saying we need to recover tradition and authority. What she's doing is saying, this is a reality right now. This is a problem, and we need to face it. So she's not really giving a solution right here, and that's often a stumbling block with these philosophers too. With Wittgenstein as well, he's not outlining a systematic philosophy right here. He's providing a critique and inviting consideration about things in a way.
What year did Dewey write?
1897.
Yeah.
Oh, there it is. Okay, so are you saying that Hannah Arendt is refuting John Dewey's philosophy, or just critiquing John Dewey's philosophy of pragmatism?
Well, she's critiquing American pragmatism generally, insofar as it had a certain kind of influence on American education, and John Dewey was probably of all the most influential in that respect.
Okay, because that makes more sense now, because she talks about on page 10. I'm just going to briefly mention it because it smacked of what's going on with today's kids, of treating children as an oppressed minority in need of liberation. It's actually, she said, been tried out in modern educational practice. She says authority has been discarded by the adults. And this can mean only one thing, that the adults refuse to assume responsibility for the world into which they have brought the children. And it just reminded me of so many things going on today. But I remember last year going to my daughter's swimming pool, and there's no more adult swim time. It's all for the children. And I said, well, what gives? Like, I want to do my laps. And she goes, oh, Mom, don't you know that children are like dogs today? They're a protected class. And she runs communities, and she didn't mean it in jest. She just said children are a protected class and they have all the rights today. And then I fast forwarded, and as I'm reading Hannah Arendt in 1954 here, I'm thinking, this sounds like Black Lives Matters and the Antifa, the anarchists. It's like, well, she just went through that in Nazi Germany. So she's coming fresh off the experience. But I could, like you said, I was looking for a conclusion or a solution. And I thought that she was saying we need to go back to, she didn't say this, but I thought she was inferring we need to go back to to tradition. We need to teach history. We don't know, we won't know where we're going unless we know where we came from. We need to teach the classics. And I just assume that she's saying we have to teach kids history. We can't just, like Dewey, just throw them out there and say, ooh, let's see what this child's psyche is all about. Let's watch this child and let this child develop its creative impulses. Like, where is the structure? Where's the boundaries? So anyway, I wish, I'm talking out of my hat because I'm not an educator, but I was hoping that the people that, are educators would be here tonight. But maybe we can do that in the future, John, if we all decide to get together once a month or something.
So going back to the authority theme, and first just a note about Hannah Arendt. She is probably one of the most brilliant contemporary political philosophers, and also one of the most difficult to pin down. Nobody can quite classify her as what she is in any of the terms that we are accustomed to using now.
Okay.
So I wouldn't, I wouldn't try to put her in a camp there unless it's going to be the anti-totalitarian camp, because she also wrote the most extensive and most in-depth critique of totalitarianism.
Okay.
It's
Thank you.
called The Origins of Totalitarianism. So, and what she's pointing out is that the modern loss of tradition and authority, if it's not addressed, leads nowhere but totalitarianism. So
I see. Okay.
So what on this theme of authority, how does she differentiates between authority and qualifications? So how can what's the difference there between authority and qualifications?
Well, I thought what she was saying is in the old days, if you were going to be a teacher, you had to be an expert in your field. You had to, you walked on the teaching stage, and your success or failure depends on your expertise and your ability to deliver on that particular subject. For instance, say you're going to teach botany or biology.
So does being an expert give you the authority?
Well, I get now, again, I said yes, because because the opposite of that is what she was describing. What she was describing are these teachers that don't have an expertise in anything, but they just get a degree in the skill of relaying information, but they're not qualified to teach on any particular subject. And I just happened, my goddaughter is at UVA getting her master's, and she doesn't
Well, let's
have
back up
any.
to that for a second.
Yeah.
So then,
Yeah.
in that case, if teachers started to learn subjects better, just assuming that critique is correct, if they started, would that constitute a recovery of authority?
Well, there's more to it than that. I mean, it's all of society. Parents have to buy into it too. They have to buy into the fact that children are blank slates, and it's the parents and the teacher's responsibility. Well, now I'm using my words, to help form them and to grow them up into the world. She makes this very scathing comment somewhere about parents not having interest. They just procreate, and then they don't even bother. They don't want to be bothered with educating them.
She says anyone who refuses to assume joint responsibility for the world, in other words, joint responsibility with one another and with their children, should not have children and must not be allowed to take part in educating them. So yeah, that's pretty scathing. But then just below that, she's talking about in education, this responsibility for the world takes the form of authority. She says the authority of the educator and the qualifications of the teacher are not the same thing. So why aren't they the same thing? What differentiates having authority from being knowledgeable?
Well, go ahead, Marty.
No, I was going to see if I could clarify that question a little bit. Are you asking, it's one thing to be certified by the state of Virginia as a teacher. It's another thing to be able to convey your knowledge to students so that they understand it, and at the end of the semester now come away with a new knowledge. Is that what you're aiming at?
Well, I think that authority, she might be even referring to an idea of authority that is a bit deeper than that and a bit more comprehensive.
Was it political authority she was talking about on page 11? She said,
Hang on,
it is naturally.
Dad,
Okay.
do you want to jump in?
Sorry.
Right below where you were quoting on the top of page 10, the teacher's qualification consists in knowing the world and being able to instruct it to others. But his authority rests in his assumption of the responsibilities for that world. So it's one thing to be qualified to do something. It's another one is to take charge of that. You have these teachers that are very knowledgeable, but they get into the classroom and frankly, they're a bore. because they don't command the authority of the subject, but they're reading off a piece of paper, as opposed to somebody that comes in and has, and I don't think we're talking about the world. I think we're talking about the classroom here. Has authority of the classroom so that they not only understand the material, but can impart it to others and have that command of the class. It's very similar to leadership. It's very similar to leadership. Everybody can't be a leader. I mean, you have these experts. I was just talking to somebody today who I just got off the phone with somebody, and you know who it was, and he was telling me that his company was doing a strategic plan on something. This guy's a triple PhD academic, and he says, frankly, all I want to do is give talks and do research. I don't want to do any of this stuff. So I think what she's saying and what she's meaning, and again, I think you have to put it into the context of when she's writing. And I think it's real important that we put it in a context where all these people are writing, that it's the command of the classroom, more or less. When somebody asks a related question, not quite on the topic, that person, as an expert, can either answer that question or say that, hey, that's not my field and that's for somebody else, rather than, what they're doing now is they're just popping off on anything. I think that's the difference. I think it's
so that would be a sense. We're talking about authority as a quality of the individual. So there's one idea. Barry, what do you want to say?
Aren't we talking about pretty crimped views of education? And if we start from the proposition that parents are the primary educators of the child, aren't we talking about a whole different thing? And like your dad just said, we're talking about the classroom. Well, the education doesn't just occur in a classroom, and educators aren't just teachers in the formal sense of being licensed by the state or put in a classroom by the church. And the primary educators are the parents. When you go with Dewey, I mean, his is sort of, it takes a village.
Mm-hmm.
To control you and mold you. The parents are the first communicators, and they're the primary communicators, or should be, to the children, the primary educators of them. And if you don't start there, you're off base already.
Yeah, that's certainly looking at it from the Catholic perspective. I think that was my central critique of Dewey the first time I read him. Where's the family here?
Me too.
On Arendt, did you catch where she talks about the relationship of different types of authority in the classroom, in political authority, and then in the family? What the relationship of these is? So later on this page, on page 10, in the last paragraph there, she says there's a connection between the loss of authority in public and political life and in the private pre-political realms of the family and the school. So, and the process that she's outlining in this section is she's saying the loss of authority first starts in the public realm, and then and then it descends into the classroom, and then it's going, and then what she's saying is now it's descending into the family. And what she's doing is drawing a comparison between this and how the ancients justified or compared or talked about political authority, where the prime example of natural authority, in other words, just something that is to be obeyed without need to seek recourse in violence or logical persuasion, is the family. And then that serves as the model for other less than natural forms of authority. So she's talking about this reversal. So what do you think about that? How does that fit in here? How does this cause a problem for educators?
Well, my understanding when she talked about Plato and Aristotle was that, again, going back to what we studied early on in our course, that Plato and Aristotle, during the times of the Roman Empire, prior to the Pax Romana, there was nothing but war all the time. And the peace that was established in Rome was revered because the Republic had a hierarchy of authority and a really strict structure that was respected, and it carried over into the Americas too, and that we grew up with, she said, with the thought to regard the authority of parents over children, of teachers over pupils, and that was the model by which to understand political authority. But then she goes on to say that can be dangerous because look what happened in Nazi Germany. You don't want to have that absolute authority in the government. You want equal. She never came out and said it, but I got the feeling she agreed with a participatory government of sane adults. But because she went in and out with that with the political authority versus educational authority, teacher authority. So that's why I kind of got lost. I wish you would just come out and give me a sound bite. Maybe you can tell me, John.
What is your question exactly?
Well, she's differentiating between political authority, between teacher authority, and family authority. It seems like she reveres the family authority. And she's disparaging this concept that's crept into society that parents don't have to have authority. Like on page 11, she says, on the other hand, modern man could find no clearer expression for his dissatisfaction with the world, for his disgust with things as they are, than by his refusal to assume, in respect to his children, responsibility for all this. It is as though parents daily said, in this world, even we are not very securely at home, how to move about in it, what to know, what skills to master. They're mysteries to us too. You must try to make out as best you can. In any case, you are not entitled to call us into account as your parents. We are innocent. We wash your hands of you, children. And I thought, wow, what's going on in 1954 to make her say that something was going on in society where the children, there was a loss of authority in the family. And then she goes into the whole New World Order, the Novus Ordo Seclorum. That was the Freemasons, right? The Novus Ordo Seclorum. Is she writing against that?
No, I don't think so.
Oh.
But this is also where I find it hard. She's writing about the mid-50s. And if there was ever a good family structure in the United States, it was during the 50s.
Right.
We had the best family structure you could ask for. My parents lived in grew up in the 50s, and they said that was the best time ever. Then you get into the 60s, and yes, that's when you get into all of this stuff. But the 50s itself, I don't see where she's coming from to say, whole family structures are going down. It wasn't. It was Dewey. That was the most solid structure of society we ever had at that time. So I don't know where she's pulling this from.
I think the way to look at it is that she's seeing a process that began philosophically and politically, has affected politics and education, and she's looking towards the future at the effect it's going to have on the family. And that's kind of where you know, when these essays are compiled together and they're called Between Past and Future, that's part of it too, is she's, and Catherine, again, going back to your question of, well, what's the conclusion here? Well, mainly what she's doing is asking you to walk through her observations with you and see what is happening to ideas concerning authority in the modern world. And now we can look back and see the prophetic nature of it.
Yeah.
But at her time, it was, as Marty is pointing out, I saw my dad nodding too. Obviously, I wasn't alive in the 50s, but looking back, we can see that even though that hadn't taken place yet, we can see what's happened since.
So it's also during that period immediately post World War II. I mean, America and the psychological establishment and part of our intelligence agencies made a distinct effort through books like The Authoritarian Personality to break the family. You know, the German model of the strong family was held up as what led to Hitler, what led to the acceptance by the German people of what were viewed as the horrible things that Hitler did. And you know, there's a conscious effort to change society, you know, to break the authoritarian personality, which was the family structure, and especially the father-led family.
Yeah, that's a very. Go ahead.
I say she may have been extremely aware of that.
Go ahead, Dad.
This timeline is very interesting. Dewey wrote at the turn of the century.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, you have Marx writing somewhere around that time. You know, you have, and I think from a Catholic point of view, you have Leo the 13th writing Rerum Novarum, having to do with social issues and labor, but sort of on the same twist. And fast forward to the paper that we're talking about, which was written in the 50s. You have an older brother that was in German school in the 70s, and you have a sister who's sitting looking at me right now. And the Germans after World War II basically reverted back to a traditional model of education, a very, very traditional model, which we really, really liked. And it was sort of a classical STEM model, if you want to call it that. Not dissimilar to what I got at the military academy, classical STEM. But your brother we were deciding whether he goes in the German school. You know, at 7th grade, you decide you're either going to the Hochschule where you get a trade, or you're going into the gymnasium where you go off to college. In 7th grade, and he was like right there, and he'd qualified. But we went and talked to one of the educators. We were in Augsburg at the time, and he says, you know, we got talking philosophically about education. Dewey's name came up several times in that conversation. And he was looking at America, and he says, let's face it, we're about 15 years behind America. We look at what America was doing 15 years ago. That's what we're doing now. And, you know, he basically says, you know, this whole Nazi thing and that just put us behind, and we're starting fresh. But we're looking at, now this was the late 70s. We're looking at what's going on in America right now, and we have some concerns because they're heading back toward Dewey. They're, you know, where we are going, and we don't know which way we're going in the future, because, you know, they got into the new math, they got into all sorts of things. So this is playing out in real life, and you know, some of the more traditional educators are trying to fight it, and you know, the German school, the family was just definitely part of everything that we did, part of the school, which, you know, from a Catholic point of view, the parents are responsible for the education of the children, and the government and the church are supposed to support them with that, which is exactly opposite of what Dewey's proponing, and which is exactly opposite to where we are today.
Yeah, those are some great points. I want to go to this theme of authority versus authoritarian. So now in the passage, now Cindy, Catherine, and Dad, in the packet that you got from me, it doesn't have this page, because this is in section 2 of Arendt's paper on page 6. She says, the non-authoritarian teacher, okay, non-authoritarian teacher who would like to abstain from all methods of compulsion because he is able to rely on his own authority, can no longer exist. So this differentiation between authority and authoritarian. So now, so what happens, what she's pointing to here is what happens when authority is lost and you're trying to maintain control, and you no longer have an innate sense of authority that is recognized by yourself and others. Then what do you resort to? What do you have at your disposal? If you don't have
Nothing. You have chaos in the.
if you're going to avoid chaos,
Okay, can you, she used authority twice, and it seemed to have two different meanings in the same sentence. Can you help differentiate what she means there?
so she's differentiating between authority and authoritarian.
Okay, and which one means which?
So, well, she talks about being able to rely on one's own authority, and that being, if you can rely on your own authority, what she says is you can abstain from all methods of compulsion.
Okay, so when she means rely on your own authority, it is because you have a knowledge of and passion for your subject that gets transmitted to the students, and the students buy into your authority. Is that
I wouldn't make it as specific as that, but what she's talking about here with the word authority, one's own authority, is real authority, the authority that's been lost. So what's the difference now if we think about the trend of people saying question authority? Do they, if you're somebody who says question authority, if you've got a question authority sticker on your car, do you differentiate between authority and authoritarian? I mean, if you see me
Probably think you probably think of all authority as authoritarian.
right, yeah, I'd agree with that. So if you,
Yep.
if for people who say question authority, it's probably because they associate those two things. Authority means authoritarian. So why have we come to that? Is that true? And if not, why not? What marks the difference between authority and authoritarian?
Authoritarian usually means some form of coercion, some form of artificial control over the other person.
Let me read another passage. This is from the same book. It's from a different essay, actually the one that's called What is Authority? She does say authority always demands obedience. Okay, so if there's real authority, it demands that it is to be obeyed. But here's how she differentiates it from other things we might call authority. She says, where force is used, authority itself has failed. So if we attempt to use authority and it fails, then that's when coercion is resorted to. On the other hand, where arguments are used, authority is left in abeyance. In other words, if we're trying to convince somebody to obey by using persuasion, by using arguments, that is setting authority to the side. And say, we're not relying on authority right now, we're relying on reason. So that might be a way, a model for understanding what she's talking about here. She has a very specific thing in mind when she's talking about authority, and it doesn't involve the need to resort to reasons, to persuasion, or to coercion. So when I tell my daughter to do something and she immediately does it, she's demonstrating that she recognizes my authority. When I tell her to do something and she says, why? I might say, just do it, and reassert my authority, or I might put authority in abeyance and explain, you need to do this in order this, and this. And she'll say, oh, okay. And then she goes and does it. That's not a failure.
But then when you say that, you're reestablishing your authority.
Right. Those
because
are related.
You've won the argument. You've convinced her through reason.
That's true, but it's still leaving authority in abeyance. It's giving evidence of authority, perhaps.
When she says, thank you, I hear you, I disagree with you, and I won't obey you, and you make her do it anyway, then you're an authoritarian?
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm authoritarian. I would say that in that instance, authority has failed. And that's on account of her inability to recognize the natural authority.
So I went one step further. It said, and you make her do it. Right.
Yeah.
What is that? That is asserting failed authority as opposed to authoritarianism?
That is, I mean, I would say that's an implementation of natural authority. But the more, I mean, I think that's easier to talk about in the family, where the natural nature, where its natural sense can be recognized more easily, and then broadening that out to education and politics is where we run into the difficulties, because it's not so well defined.
I don't know. Take the draft. It's pretty well defined then. They gave you a number. They said, go. You said, I disagree with you. They said, you're going to jail. You said, I'm going to Canada. And it was pretty well defined then, at least.
Well, if reasons are demanded in every instance, then power might be recognized. Power might become clear, and this is where we differentiate between the authoritarian and authority. The authoritarian can assert power, but authority in practice doesn't involve necessarily having to resort to reasons in every case. And we could look at the trend of, we could look at how does this relate to how does this a culmination of Enlightenment humanism and liberalism in the broad sense of putting individual liberty above all else.
But on that topic on page 6, talking about preserving the child's liberty by, she saw the trend where play, allowing a child to play, not work, in an academic setting, was being taught or was being demonstrated in the schools or somewhere in the environment. And she claims that you're infantilizing the child. You're keeping the child at an infant level. And the last paragraph, she says the close connection between the two things, the substitution of doing for learning and of playing for working, is directly illustrated. My light went out here. It's directly illustrated by the teaching of languages. The child is to learn by speaking, that is, by doing, not by studying grammar and syntax. In other words, he is to learn a foreign language in the same way that as an infant, he learned his own language, as though at play and in the uninterrupted continuity of simple existence. And then she says, quite apart from the question of whether this is possible or not, it is possible to a limited degree only when one can keep the child all day long in the foreign-speaking environment. It is perfectly clear that this procedure consciously attempts to keep the older child as far as possible at the infant level, the very thing that should prepare the child for the world of adults. The gradually acquired habit of work and not playing is done away with in favor of the autonomy and liberty of the world of childhood. And that is exactly what we see in the public school system today. In fact, when you brought me the papers, my catechist teacher was on the phone with me saying parents, their kids can't print. They're in the 5th grade. They can't do their homework. They don't know how to write. But the homeschool kids and the Catholic schooled kids are light years ahead of them. Reading, writing, cursive, Latin. I mean, they know it all. But it seems like this Dewey system that was instituted back in the 19th century, or at least introduced, it's a failure, because the public school system today has infantilized people. Reading, writing, and arithmetic they can't even do, let alone the classics.
Yeah, that's she does talk about this idea of making the world of childhood absolute, and then about, did you see what her talking about, relating this again back to the family? What is significant about the family in the child's life to Arendt? She talks about this especially on page 8.
She was really into that was very interesting too, the privacy issue. She said, because the child must be protected against the world, his traditional place is in the family, whose adult members daily return back from the outside world and withdraw into the security of private life within the 4 walls. These 4 walls within which people's private family life is lived constitute a shield against the world, and specifically against the public aspect of the world. They
So
enclose.
I'm going to jump in here.
No, that's okay.
What is she? What is it about the child that makes this private life necessary for them? Why doesn't that same thing apply necessarily to adults? What's the difference? How does she draw the distinction?
Well, she didn't use the word, but she used the word life qua life. They need to learn about life, and part of life is boundaries, because if we don't have boundaries, we're going to hurt ourselves. But to let the village raise you, to not have the security and privacy of family life where there is structure, and it's a microcosm of a kingdom. It's you got the king and the queen and the subjects, and so that's
the third paragraph on that page, the very last sentence she says, children, that is, human beings in process of becoming but not yet complete, are thereby forced to expose themselves to the light of a public existence. Does that mean that children aren't human? Or what does she mean by that?
Maybe that they're still developing.
Right. Right.
That's-
So,
I read her in the context of more traditional Catholic context, which is the family is the natural institution, and it is your protection against the state, against other organizations, allowing you to develop fully. It's not just the child who needs it, but it's the child who needs it most. And this is a community that protects you against the state, against the larger bodies which may be attacking you. I mean, use the example of Hollywood. I mean, a kid that goes out there that has no family is used completely, sexually, emotionally abused. You know, that's just the way our society is. The natural protection for the child as it grows, which could be the becoming she's talking about, is the family, father, mother, you know, brothers and sisters of the community grow up in, and love is the bond. Is something that's much less desirable than the bond.
Dad?
I think the first paragraph on that page pretty much lays out her premise in the, and what we've been talking about, the Catholic tradition of the parents being responsible for the education of their children. They summon children into the life from conception. They simultaneously introduce them to the world. Now, granted, when at conception, it takes 9 months before the baby pops out. And when the baby pops out is not a full-grown adult. It's the same thing here. The child is nurtured through life, and goes on to say it's their responsibility. In education, they assume responsibility for both, for the life and development of the children and for the continuance of the world. So, and that's where John Paul II in Familiaris Consortio talks about it. The father's role is external to the house. The mother's traditional role is internal to the house. And so he comes home, he's pushing the external. Of course, as the children are growing, they're gaining more maturity in the home until they go. We were rowing. I was rowing with your daughter, kayaking on the Occoquan, and there was we ran across an osprey nest, and we saw one of there was a mother and a father and 2 babies. These weren't babies; these were juveniles. And we saw one of the juveniles flutter up about 2 feet, hover up, and came back down. Wasn't ready to take off. And, you know, we were watching them, and they weren't ready to go. And mom and dad, you know, they were trying, but they weren't ready to release them. I went back with one of my other grandchildren. About 4 months later, there's only 2. Mom and dad were the only 2 left in the nest. The other 2 were going out. So it's a gradual, and I think she's talking about it here. The child required special protection and care so that nothing destructive may happen from him in the world. And she's talking about child, and I don't know whether she defines a child, but, you know, not an adult yet.
Mm-hmm. So let's back up from here, back to Dewey, and see what are the positive or negative aspects of the view outlined by Dewey in his creed, and how does that conflict with some resonance that we're finding in Hannah Arendt, where we can see some correspondence with our tradition.
Well, right off the bat, in Article 2, what is a school? The school is primarily a social institution. Education being a social process, where Arndt basically says the family is a social institution. So already you have a conflict.
Mm-hmm. So does Dewey talk about the family at all here, the role of the family?
I don't read.
I don't see it, but I haven't read the whole thing.
Now he he talks a few times about the home, right? He mentions, let's see, this is also in Article 2 on the previous, let's see, this is not right where Article 2 begins, but on the next page. The school life should grow out of the home life. And he talks about the home as the form of social life in which the child has been nurtured. But it's all,
Oh, yeah.
but how, I mean, how is this different? Can we say anything from this about how he views the family?
Sure, he has the idea of what the ideal child slash citizen slash person is, and the family's subordinate to that insofar as they support and allow what he wants done. Good. Insofar as they don't, they're the enemy. Have to be contradicted and put in their place so the child can develop in the best way possible as he sees it, as he wants it, he being Dewey.
So the value of what the home provides being seen in terms of the society rather than the family being the determining factor.
And he's a pragmatist. He
Yeah.
has an outcome he wants. Whatever works toward it is good. Whatever doesn't isn't.
Yeah. So this passage here, he presumes some sort of stability in the home life, but it's all directed, as Jerry's saying, it's all directed towards the end and the purpose he has in mind.
The end and purpose is that he says the school is the form of community life. The focus of community life isn't the family, it is the school. But then school ends one day, so then what's going to be, so the community itself is of paramount importance. And it seems to me he's saying that everybody has to comply with whatever the rules of the community are.
That's there's an interesting sort of with pragmatism, there's an aspect of conservatism in that it accepts things as they are. You know, what the culture values is what it values. But there's an inconsistency in that there's no arbiter of truth.
Huh.
Right? So that's something to look at. So what is truth for Dewey? Where does truth come into education, and what the values should be? The only I could find where on the next page, this is the end of Article 2, just before Article 3. At the top, he talks about moral education, and it seems from that passage that the quote-unquote unity of work and thought is the goal. So unity of work and thought. So what, again, going back to pragmatist, what works? What helps us all work together as the goal? The goal of education isn't truth. That's the old way for Dewey. So did you find anything in here that you thought sounded great? I mean, I think there's a lot that can be said positively about specific things.
This is one of these political doublespeak papers where you can take individual sentences, and if you're on one side of the aisle, they make completely good sense, and if you're on the other side of the aisle, they make equal sense, as long as you don't look at a whole paragraph or a whole paper. You know, Dewey was such a a force in education, primarily around the 30s, if I'm not mistaken, during Roosevelt's time. His name keeps coming up. Of course, you keep on thinking of John Dewey, the labor leader. And, you know, sometimes you get these two mixed up and you wonder where labor comes into this whole issue here too. But he was such a strong force. So when you write a paper like this, that I'm sorry, it's part of a book. Isn't it part of a book?
I think it was first published in a journal.
In a journal. So you could, you know, it's some of these, you know, sometimes popes do that same thing. They write something. You can take two different ways. And I think there's little tidbits of good, you know. He sticks good things in here about the family in order to keep them together. But I think, you know, his true colors show up. The schools is primarily a social institution. You know, again, I'm just nitpicking words.
Yeah, let me be devil's advocate. Why can't the school be a social institution? How could you educate if not being a social institution as well?
You can, as long as the family is doing their part, I think. And in one place, I just marked it. I'm on page, oh geez, I don't know what page I'm on. I'm in Article 2, the bottom of the second page. I believe that much of the present education fails because it neglects this fundamental principle of a school as a form of community life. So, and part of the reason they're doing that, I think, is because the link between family and school at the time he's writing this has not been established yet.
I guess my fear is that he's writing this in the turn of the century, 1900s. I don't know enough of him, and I don't know enough of the culture, and I don't know enough of the education process at that time to ascribe motive or anything like that. And my fear is that we're reading 20th century, you know, stuff into what Dewey. Now, Dewey may be everything you say. I don't know, but I don't know. And as you were saying, Bob, a lot of this stuff, I can't find fault with it, you know. So am I going to then ascribe a villainous to Dewey in the sense that, oh, he's just being doublespeak here? He's writing in the 1900s. So
good point.
I don't know, you know, I just simply don't know, you know, where he's going with this.
No, that's a good point. That's a real good point.
So just for a little context, this is somewhat early in Dewey's writings. It's not the earliest, but it is before his major works. So this would be before he was really a major force in American education. And he is certainly, he's critiquing something that he observed, right? I don't know enough about it to say exactly what it was. But what I do know about is that from a philosophical standpoint, when he contrasts his view with the quote unquote old view, then he's often off the mark in where he categorizes everything, where he puts all the old stuff into one container. But I would guess that he probably has a lot of legitimate concerns about the practice of American education at the time, and that was why he became so influential. I'm guessing he probably had, in a lot of ways, an accurate critique. And you know, Marty, to your point about, I think where he says the school should be a social institution. Yeah, I mean any institution needs to be a social institution, and the question comes down to, do we have this either or that he sets up?
Or a both and,
Right.
Mm-hmm.
which I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
So let's change gears a little bit here. I want to look at a brief passage from, I want to get at least to a little bit of Wittgenstein. Okay, we're going to look at number 265 here. Number 265. This is paragraph number 265. Wittgenstein, most of this is just a transcription of his notes. Okay, this was published posthumously, and it was his students just typed up his notes to publish this. So you can certainly see the kind of journal feel that he has and his sort of play with ideas back and forth here. That's why it's often very hard to tell what did Wittgenstein believe about something. It's hard to pin him down because of that back and forth. But let's look at number 265 here. So he's asked you to imagine a table, and he's not saying a table like furniture, but a table like a list in a document, right, with columns and rows, that just exists in your imagination. He says, are we also to call it a justification if such a table is to be looked up only in the imagination? So if you can justify something just by looking it up in your own mind, by something that exists only there, then he imagines somebody objecting, somebody responding. This is where it says in quotes, well, yes, then it is a subjective justification. Then he replies, but justification consists in appealing to something independent. And then his interlocutor replies, but surely I can appeal from one memory to another. For example, I don't know if I have remembered the time of departure of a train right, and to check it, I call to mind how a page of the timetable looked. Isn't it the same here? And he says, no, for this process has got to produce a memory which is actually correct. So what's he talking about here with, and then he says the end of this section, looking up a table in the imagination is no more looking up a table than the image of the result of an imagined experiment is the result of an experiment. What's his point here with subjective justification? And if we could think of it in terms of language, the meaning of a word.
Sure about the meaning of word is it's going to have to be external to you. You can't self-justify. I guess for a word means it has to be acknowledged by others. It can't be a personal word that has meaning only to yourself.
So on that view, can you have a purely private language?
Only if you're talking. And the language requires communication. If you're not communicating, I don't think you have a language. On the other hand, can you develop a language purely privately and then try to use it with somebody else? Yes, I guess. But you're talking to yourself. I mean, that's colloquially, it means you're crazy. If it's purely private.
So I think actually, Jerry, when we were talking about Descartes, I think one of the critiques that you pointed out was that the very fact that he that he used language, Descartes was trying to figure out how to get out of his mind to the real world, right? But the very fact that he used the language to do that had to point to that, right?
He had to learn the language someplace.
Mm-hmm. So what I want to ask about then is, where in a society where the Supreme Court itself says you can define your own concept of truth, and where you can define what your gender is, where you can assert yourself to be something that you are manifestly not, then how does that apply here? How can we
You're appealing to an invalid authority.
what's that?
You're appealing to an invalid authority. The Supreme Court has no expertise and no authority in that area.
Bring us back to the authority discussion.
Yeah.
But setting aside the Supreme Court, how would we reply to the idea that you can define your own gender? That you could say I could say I'm a woman, or I'm female, or I am whatever. I don't know even how many there are.
I guess that depends on whether you're answering the question in a themistic sense or in the sense that your dad was talking about last week in your mom about how to approach somebody who's had an abortion. Do you come from objective truth, or do you try to put yourself in their situation and work from there?
Well, those I'm looking at how can we use, just more in our minds, how can we use Wittgenstein's critique?
Are we talking about speech versus language here?
Well, that's an important distinction.
So if without Stephen's citation that you mentioned in the Casey case, he basically so people just saying things that, and I think in one of the other articles, that's speech. It becomes language. Language is a broader concept, but what happens and what happened in that Casey situation, in that very particular quote that you did, was he legitimatized speech that was not truth by saying anything. Truth is something he bottled up the language. He basically intersected the concept of truth is what you think it is into our languge. And
yeah,
so
while you're talking about this, I'm going to bring up I'm going to bring my slides back to the very first one and see if we can talk about it in these terms. Okay, so we have, speech, we're talking about speech and language. And so now you're talking about legitimizing the words, the signs, over this part, legitimizing this over this.
And it's changing the definition of thing, where it's not the same for all anymore, but it's whatever you think it is.
Yeah, let's look ahead now. Next we had on Saussure. All of this is psychological. Both parts of the sign are psychological. We have this inner outer Remember, this is the dichotomy of modern philosophy that carried over into the problems of science, where we have, the person with their mind right here, which now, Saussure, it's the brain, right? Modern materialist science will make it the brain. And then we have, things out in the world. This is my lovely tree. And wondering, how do I get from here to here? And so now with this view, language is all about my ideas, and my ideas can't be wrong, right? We're not speaking about any correspondence here, whereas for Aquinas, you can't have this without this.
Mhm.
Right? This is when I asked in the next slide, what does he mean by this? We cannot understand without a phantasm. A phantasm is an experience, a sense experience of something. So that presumes the existence of other things, of which my knowledge is a likeness. A thing in its full being doesn't exist in my head. A tree doesn't exist in my mind. But the form of the tree exists in my mind, the likeness of the tree, and it's that likeness is actually the tree. It is the essence of the tree. It's not, when it gets in my head, it doesn't, I'm using the in out language again, the way I don't like to use it, but when it gets in my mind, when I know it, it doesn't become its own thing. And that's part of what Wittgenstein is critiquing. Now, Wittgenstein didn't have really a grounding in Thomistic Aristotelian epistemology, and he might have approached the problem differently had he had that. But he inherited modern epistemology with the mind-body, with the mind-matter distinction. So just to bring some of that, bring some of these things together. Well, and anything else? We can we can close it out if we've exhausted what you're interested in talking about, or we can go back to your questions on or comments on anything else here.
So, well, getting back to what you were just talking about with language, are you saying that Wittgenstein says that you got to have consensus for language? And then you were referring to Aristotle. Aristotle looked at the thing in a concrete world. And then you were showing, was it Saussure, the body with the brain looking at the tree. It seems like there's a in philosophy, they've come to recognize that we don't have to live in the concrete world anymore. We can live in an imaginary world using our brain. But there has to be a consensus, right? We all have to agree. So the idea that, there's a plague and it's going to take over the world and we got to have a vaccine because this is like the worst. It's a black plague. We're all going to die unless we get a vaccine. It's an imaginary. Everybody is is living a life of fear. We're accepting, and there's a consensus that yes, we're living in fear of the government, fear of the germ, fear of the economy collapsing. But what is reality? It's like we still don't really know. So are we going to look at it like Aquinas looked at it? Are we going to live in a concrete world and look for proof? Or are we going to look at human biology and look at heterosexual relations and say, you know what? In my imagination, I want to neuter that. I want to get rid of children and procreation. I really want to get rid of the human race. Let's all have a consensus. We're well on our way with contraception and abortion and euthanasia. So philosophically speaking, who has the authority to make these decisions? Is it the educated? Is it the uneducated? Is it a totalitarian government that's going to impose it by force? Getting back to what you were saying earlier about Hannah Arendt and imposing force when you really have no authority. So all I'm saying is this course has made me think of a lot of things. And when the Supreme Court, which is a handful of people, decide to define biology, and we're Catholics, but we're not idiots. We've already studied nature. Even if we were atheists, we look at nature, right? And we accept nature as it is. But we're living in a time where your philosophy is not my philosophy, and I'm not going to buy into it. So I'm going to either ignore you, or we're going to have a fight over it. So whatever happened to?
Let me go back to you were asking about Wittgenstein and consensus.
Yeah.
I don't think consensus is the word I would use, but what he recognizes is the social and communication aspect of language and truth. And there's a way that we recognize when somebody is using a word correctly in language, and it's not just determined by however that person decides to use it.
Mm-hmm.
If I said tomorrow I'm gonna drive. Let's see, what do I say? Tomorrow I'm gonna drive to the is. You would think he doesn't really know the meaning of the word is, and in my mind, to me, I might think I know the meaning of the word is. There's a president who very famously distinguished some meanings of the word is.
Mm-hmm.
But and here's Jason with the new baby. We'll come to you, Jason, in a minute. So the Wittgenstein's main, I don't want to say what his main point is, but one important point for him is the social character of language and the inability to have a private language. And this relates to what Arendt talks about as well in other places, about the concern of everybody defining words just as they see fit, and ultimately retreating into our own private spheres of meaning. And that would be a loss of society.
Mm-hmm.
So now when I put up the slide of the process that Aquinas and Aristotle are articulating, if that's how it works, then that's the reality. It's not that it's not that that's how it works for us, and then Saussure is how it works for somebody else, and Descartes is how it works for somebody else. If there's if Aquinas is right, then Aquinas is right for everybody. So in that sense, we're not at it's impossible to lose the ability to know and to use language. That's built into what we are. That's the character. That's the essential character of what we are. The word translated variously as reason, logic, and word in Greek, logos. It has all of these different meanings, right? It's no accident, as we saw earlier. There's no accident that comes to refer to God.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's no concern that as a species we can lose reason. It's built into who we are. So it is a matter of adjudicating between different theories, and that becomes more difficult, as you point out, when people are, as Arendt says, retreating in